The bulldozer engine roared to life as the first wedding guests turned into my driveway. White folding chairs scattered like leaves as the blade pushed through the elaborate archway that Sheriff Corinne had built on my property without permission. Her daughter's wedding cake toppled in slow motion, 3 tiers of fondant dreams crashing into the dirt. Corinne's voice cut through the morning air, screaming threats and curses as her perfect day crumbled before her eyes. But I was done being pushed around. This was my land, and today she would finally learn what that meant. My name is Tom Henderson, and for 15 years I had been living my version of the American dream on 43 acres of rolling hills in Millbrook County. The property sat like a crown jewel at the end of Oakwood Road, where ancient oak trees formed natural cathedral arches over emerald pastures that rolled down to Cedar Creek. Every morning I would walk the fence line with my coffee, watching the mist rise from the water while deer grazed in the distance. I had bought this land when it was nothing but overgrown brush and a collapsing barn. Years of weekends had transformed it into something special. I planted the flower gardens myself, rebuilt the stone walls that marked the property boundaries, and cleared the meadow where wildflowers now bloomed every spring. The old farmhouse had been restored with my own hands, from the wraparound porch to the tin roof that sang when rain fell. People often stopped by just to admire the view. The property was picture perfect, the kind of place that made photographers pull over and ask permission to capture the sunset behind the oak grove. More than once, strangers had knocked on my door asking if I would consider renting the space for weddings or family reunions. The answer was always the same polite no. This was my sanctuary, not a business. My wife Sarah had passed away 3 years earlier, and since then the land had become even more precious to me. Every tree we had planted together, every stone wall we had rebuilt, every flower bed she had designed with such care. The property was not just my home, it was our legacy. It was the place where we had planned to grow old together, watching grandchildren play in the same meadows where we had walked hand in hand for 26 years. The neighbors respected what I had built here. They understood that some places were sacred, that not everything beautiful was meant to be shared with the world. My closest neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, lived a quarter-mile down the road and often brought me fresh bread on Sundays. She would sit on the porch and tell me how much Sarah would have loved seeing the garden in full bloom. But peace never lasts forever in small towns like Millbrook. There are always people who believe that power gives them the right to take whatever they want from whoever they want. And Sheriff Corinne Hutchins was exactly that kind of person. It was a Tuesday morning in late April when Sheriff Corinne Hutchins first darkened my doorstep. I was replacing boards on the front steps when her patrol car crunched up my gravel driveway, dust clouds trailing behind like a warning of trouble to come. Corinne stepped out wearing her perfectly pressed uniform and mirrored sunglasses, every inch the small-town authority figure who had forgotten that badges are meant to serve, not rule. Corinne was a woman who wore power like expensive perfume, strong enough that everyone around her could smell it from a distance. She had been sheriff for 8 years, inheriting the position from her father who had held it for 20 years before her. The Hutchins family had been running law enforcement in Millbrook County like their personal kingdom for nearly 3 decades. "Mr. Henderson," she said, not bothering with pleasantries as she climbed my front steps, "I need to discuss something important with you." I set down my hammer and wiped my hands on my jeans. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Corinne pulled off her sunglasses and looked around the property with the calculating eyes of someone appraising real estate. "My daughter Rebecca is getting married in June. This would be the perfect location for the ceremony." The statement hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I blinked, certain I had misunderstood. "I am sorry, what?" "Your property," Corinne continued, gesturing toward the oak grove and meadow. "It is exactly what Rebecca has been dreaming of for her wedding. The trees, the view, the creek in the background. Perfect for photos." I felt my stomach tighten with the first stirrings of unease. "Sheriff, I appreciate the compliment, but I do not rent my property for events. This is my home." Corinne's expression shifted, her friendly mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Mr. Henderson, I am not asking you to rent it. I am telling you that we need to use it. Rebecca has her heart set on this location." The audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. "You are telling me, Sheriff, with all due respect, this is private property. I have every right to say no, and I am saying no." Corinne stepped closer, and I could see my reflection in her badge. "Tom, let me be clear about something. In this county, I am the law. When I need something from a citizen, I expect cooperation, especially from someone who might want to avoid having his property inspected too closely by county officials." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I had lived in small towns long enough to recognize the language of corruption when I heard it. "Are you threatening me, Sheriff?" "I am explaining reality," Corinne replied, her voice cold as Winter Creek water. "People who do not cooperate with law enforcement often find themselves dealing with all sorts of unexpected problems. Code violations, safety inspections, tax assessments. You understand?" My hands clenched at my sides. After 15 years of following every rule, paying every tax, and being a model citizen, this woman was standing on my porch threatening me because I would not surrender my most precious possession for her convenience. "The answer is still no," I said firmly. "This property is not available for your daughter's wedding or anyone else's." Corinne put her sunglasses back on, but I could feel her eyes burning into me from behind the dark lenses. "We will see about that, Mr. Henderson. We will see." She turned and walked back to her patrol car without another word, gravel crunching under her boots like bones breaking. As she drove away, I stood on my front porch and watched the dust settle, knowing with the certainty that comes from living in small towns that this was far from over. The first citation arrived exactly 1 week later. Deputy Martinez knocked on my door at 7 in the morning, looking embarrassed as he handed me the official paperwork. Apparently, my mailbox was 6 inches too close to the road according to County Ordinance 47B, a regulation that had not been enforced in the 20 years I had lived there. "Sorry about this, Mr. Henderson," Martinez muttered, unable to meet my eyes. "Orders from the sheriff." 2 days later, it was my fence posts. According to the new inspector, 3 posts on the eastern boundary were allegedly encroaching on county right-of-way by 4 inches. The fine was $250, plus mandatory surveying costs. I pulled out the original survey from when I bought the property, clearly showing the fence was well within my boundaries, but the inspector shrugged and said he was just following orders. The harassment campaign escalated with methodical precision. County health officials arrived to inspect my well water, claiming they had received anonymous complaints about contamination. The water tested perfectly clean, but the inspection fee was still $300. Fire department officials cited me for having dead branches in trees that posed a potential fire hazard, despite the fact that every property in the county had similar dead branches. Each citation came with official letterhead, legal language, and the implicit threat of escalating fines if I did not comply immediately. The system was designed to look legitimate to anyone who did not understand what was really happening. To an outside observer, it appeared that Tom Henderson was simply a property owner who could not keep up with basic maintenance and safety requirements. But I knew better. Every violation notice, every surprise inspection, Every impossible deadline was Corinne Hutchins using the power of her office to wage personal war against a citizen who had dared to tell her no. She was showing me what happened to people who did not cooperate with the Hutchins family agenda. The legal fees began mounting like storm clouds on the horizon. Each citation required either payment or a court challenge, and challenging meant hearing lawyers I could not afford. My savings account, carefully built over years of modest living, started hemorrhaging money to legal fees and compliance costs. $3,000 in the first month alone. Word spread through town with the speed that bad news always travels in small communities. I started noticing the change in how people looked at me at the grocery store, the way conversations stopped when I entered the post office. Corinne had been busy spreading her version of events, painting me as a difficult property owner who refused to follow basic safety regulations. Tom seems to be having some trouble keeping up with his place, I overheard Mrs. Mitchell telling the cashier at Millbrook Market. Sheriff says there have been multiple violations out there. The isolation was almost worse than the financial burden. Friends who had known me for decades began treating me with careful politeness, the way people act around someone they suspect might be unstable. Phone calls became less frequent. Invitations to community gatherings stopped coming. But the worst part was watching Corinne's smug satisfaction whenever our paths crossed in town. She would nod politely and ask how I was handling all my property issues, with a concern so fake it could have been made of plastic. Her message was clear. This could all stop the moment I agreed to let her use my land. 3 weeks into the harassment campaign, I contacted the state attorney general's office to file a complaint about abuse of power. The woman who took my call was sympathetic, but explained that investigating sheriff misconduct required substantial evidence of criminal behavior, not just aggressive enforcement of existing regulations. Unless you can prove she is fabricating violations or taking bribes, our hands are tied, she explained. Sheriffs have broad discretion in how they enforce county ordinances. I hung up the phone and stared out my kitchen window at the oak grove where Sarah and I had been married 27 years earlier. The same trees that Corinne wanted to commandeer for her daughter's celebration. The irony was bitter as medicine. The very beauty that made this place special had made it a target for someone who believed everything beautiful should belong to her. That night I walked the property boundaries as I did every evening, but for the first time I felt like a prisoner in my own paradise. Corinne had turned my dream into a battlefield, and she held all the weapons. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Thursday morning in early May. I was drinking coffee on the front porch, watching water drip from the oak leaves, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Mr. Henderson, this is Jennifer from Elite Catering Services. I am calling to confirm the final guest count for the Hutchins wedding reception at your property on June 15th. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. I am sorry, what did you say? The wedding reception. We have you down as the venue contact for the Hutchins-Morrison wedding. We need to finalize the tent placement and confirm access for our trucks. My blood turned to ice water. There is no wedding happening on my property. Someone has made a serious mistake. Jennifer sounded confused but professional. Sir, we have all the paperwork right here. The contract is signed by Sheriff Hutchins as the event coordinator, and we have a copy of the property use agreement with your signature. That is impossible. I never signed any agreement. Would you like me to fax you a copy of the documents we have on file? 10 minutes later, I was staring at a perfectly forged property use agreement bearing what looked exactly like my signature. The document authorized Sheriff Corinne Hutchins to use Henderson property for a wedding celebration on June 15th, including full access for vendors and guests. The signature was so convincing that, for a moment, I questioned my own memory. But I knew I had never signed this document. Corinne had either forged my signature or had someone else do it for her. She was not just harassing me into compliance anymore. She was proceeding as if I had already agreed, using falsified documents to legitimize her theft of my property. The phone calls started coming daily after that. Wedding photographers wanting to schedule site visits. Florists asking about power access for refrigerated storage. The rental company confirming delivery times for tables, chairs, and a massive white tent. Each call revealed another piece of Corinne's elaborate plan to steal my property for her daughter's perfect day. I tried calling the vendors to explain the situation, but they all had the same response. They had signed contracts with Sheriff Hutchins, they had been paid deposits, and they had legal documents authorizing their access to Henderson property. From their perspective, I was just a property owner trying to back out of an agreement at the last minute. When I contacted my lawyer, the news got worse. The forged documents looked official enough that proving fraud would require expensive handwriting analysis and potentially lengthy court proceedings. Even if we could prove the signature was fake, getting an injunction to stop the wedding would take weeks of legal maneuvering that might not conclude before June 15th. Your best bet is to contact the state police and file criminal charges for forgery, my lawyer explained. But that is not going to stop the wedding from happening in 3 weeks. I tried calling the state police, but they referred me back to the county sheriff's department for local property disputes. The irony would have been funny if it was not destroying my life. I was being told to report Corinne's crimes to Corinne herself. My attempts to contact anyone above Corinne in the law enforcement hierarchy hit dead ends. The county commissioners said it was a civil matter. The state attorney general's office said they could not interfere with local wedding permits. Everyone passed the buck until the circle led right back to the person committing the crime. As June 15th approached, I watched trucks begin arriving at neighboring properties to scout access routes. Wedding planners drove slowly past my house, taking photos and making notes. My private sanctuary was being measured and evaluated by strangers who had been told they had every right to be there. The most infuriating part was Corinne's continued performance of innocence whenever we crossed paths in town. She would ask how my property troubles were going and express hope that we could work something out soon. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew I was powerless to stop her through legal channels. 3 weeks until my land would be invaded by hundreds of strangers celebrating a wedding I had never authorized, on property that represented everything I held sacred. Corinne had backed me into a corner where the law could not protect me, and the system was designed to favor whoever held the badge. June 10th arrived gray and humid, the kind of morning that promised thunderstorms by evening. I was sitting on my front porch trying to drink coffee with steady hands when the first wedding vendor truck rumbled up my driveway. Elite Party Rentals had arrived to begin setup, 5 days ahead of the ceremony. The driver climbed out and started unloading equipment without so much as a greeting. When I approached him, he pulled out a work order signed by Sheriff Hutchins authorizing full setup beginning June 10th. "Sir, you need to move," the driver said when I planted myself in front of his truck. "We have a job to do here." "This is my property," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "You do not have permission to be here." The driver called his supervisor, who called Corinne, who arrived 20 minutes later with 2 patrol cars, and an attitude that could have cut steel. She stepped out of her cruiser wearing her uniform like armor and her authority like a weapon. "Mr. Henderson, you are interfering with a legitimate business operation," Karen announced loud enough for the growing crowd of workers to hear. "I suggest you go inside and let these people do their jobs." "This is my land, Karen. You cannot just steal it because you wear a badge." Karen stepped closer, close enough that I could see my reflection in her sunglasses. "Tom, I tried to do this the easy way. I gave you opportunities to cooperate, but my daughter is getting married on this property in 5 days, and nothing you do is going to stop that." "We will see about that." Karen smiled, the kind of cold expression that never reached her eyes. "Yes, we will. Jenkins, if Mr. Henderson interferes with these workers again, arrest him for obstruction." Deputy Jenkins shifted uncomfortably but nodded. I recognized him from high school, back when his name was Jimmy, and he used to help me change oil in my garage. Now he wore Karen's uniform and followed Karen's orders, even when those orders meant arresting innocent neighbors. I watched the rental company unload tables and chairs onto my front lawn while Karen supervised like a general commanding occupied territory. White folding chairs stacked up beside my flower garden. Round tables leaned against the oak tree where Sarah and I had carved our initials 30 years ago. The violation felt physical, like strangers rummaging through my bedroom drawers. That afternoon, the catering truck arrived. Then the florist van. By evening, my property looked like the staging area for an invasion, which was exactly what it was. Karen had declared war on my rights as a property owner, and she was winning through sheer abuse of power. I spent that night walking the fence lines in the dark, trying to figure out how to fight back against an enemy who controlled the entire legal system. Every option led to the same dead end. The courts were too slow. The state authorities were too distant. My neighbors were too intimidated to help. Karen had created the perfect crime, stealing my property using the very laws that were supposed to protect it. At 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the barn where I kept my old Ford tractor and various farm equipment. The tractor had been Sarah's idea, purchased for maintaining the larger pastures and clearing brush. Beside it sat the brush hog attachment, designed for cutting through thick vegetation and small trees. But it was the piece of equipment in the back corner that caught my attention. The small bulldozer I had bought 2 years earlier for a drainage project near the creek. I had considered selling it after the project was finished, but Sarah had convinced me to keep it for future improvements. As I stared at that bulldozer in the dim light filtering through the barn windows, a thought began forming. Not a plan yet, just the seed of an idea that would either save my dignity or destroy what was left of my life. Karen believed she could steal my property because she controlled the legal system. She thought her badge made her untouchable, and her position made her right. But property rights went deeper than badges and uniforms. They went back to the fundamental principle that a man's land was his castle, and he had the right to defend it. The wedding was in 5 days. The guests would arrive expecting to see a perfect ceremony in a perfect setting. Karen was counting on my compliance, my fear of authority, my respect for law and order. She had forgotten that sometimes law and order fail. And when they do, men like me have to decide whether to surrender or fight back with whatever tools we have available. I walked back to the house as dawn broke over the oak grove, and for the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I was going to do. June 15th dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect morning that Karen had probably been praying for. By 7 a.m., the wedding setup was complete. White chairs arranged in perfect rows facing an elaborate archway draped with flowers that cost more than most people made in a month. Round reception tables scattered across my meadow like lily pads on a stolen pond. A massive white tent covered half my front lawn, transforming my home into someone else's celebration. I had spent the night in the barn, sitting with the bulldozer and thinking about Sarah. She would have understood what I was about to do. She had always said that some lines could not be crossed, some violations could not be tolerated. Sometimes, Tom, she used to tell me, being polite just enables bullies to keep bullying. At 8:30, I heard the first cars arriving. Corinne's family and early guests parking along my fence line, walking across my property like they owned it. Children ran through my flower garden while adults posed for photos under my oak trees. The theft was complete. They had not just stolen my land, they had stolen my peace, my privacy, and my dignity. I fired up the bulldozer at 9 a.m. sharp. The engine roared to life with a diesel growl that echoed across the valley like thunder from a clear sky. I had spent 2 hours that morning checking the hydraulics, testing the blade controls, making sure everything was working perfectly. This machine had moved tons of earth during the creek drainage project. Today it would move something more important. I drove the bulldozer out of the barn and down the hill toward the wedding setup, blade lowered to ground level. The first thing I hit was the gift table, a delicate antique thing covered in white lace and topped with perfectly wrapped presents. The blade caught it dead center and scattered wrapped boxes across the meadow like confetti from a very expensive explosion. The wedding cake was next, 3 tiers of fondant perfection that had probably taken days to create. It toppled in slow motion, a masterpiece of sugar and dreams crashing into the dirt with a wet thud that I felt more than heard over the engine noise. By the time the guests realized what was happening, I was already through the first row of chairs. White folding seats scattered like startled birds as the blade pushed through Corinne's perfect ceremony setup. The archway, that elaborate symbol of her daughter's special day, collapsed in a tangle of flowers and fabric that caught on the bulldozer's tracks and dragged behind me like a wedding train made of destruction. I could see people running and screaming, but the engine noise muffled their voices into background static. Corinne herself stood beside her patrol car, hands on her hips, screaming orders that nobody could hear over the sound of justice being served by heavy machinery. The white tent was my masterpiece. I approached it from the side, blade raised to catch the support poles. The entire structure collapsed like a deflated balloon, trapping tables and chairs underneath acres of white canvas. A few wedding guests who had taken refuge under the tent found themselves scrambling out from under the fabric, looking like ghosts emerging from the wreckage of someone else's entitled dreams. I made 3 complete passes through the reception area, making sure every table was overturned, every chair was scattered, every decoration was reduced to expensive debris. The flowers that had been arranged with such care were now mulch under the bulldozer tracks. The dance floor was plowed under like a failed crop. Throughout the destruction, I stayed carefully within my property boundaries. Every crushed table, every scattered chair, every demolished decoration was on my land, stolen through forged documents and corrupt authority. I was not vandalizing someone else's wedding. I was reclaiming my own property from thieves who had used badges instead of masks. When the demolition was complete, I parked the bulldozer in the middle of what had been the ceremony space and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I could hear birds singing in the oak trees and the creek bubbling in the distance, the same peaceful sounds that had greeted me every morning for 15 years. I climbed down from the bulldozer and walked through the wreckage, past overturned tables and scattered flowers, past shocked wedding guests and furious family members. Corinne was waiting for me at the edge of the destruction, her face purple with rage and humiliation. "You are under arrest," she snarled, reaching for her handcuffs. "For what?" I asked calmly, clearing brush on my own property. That was when I noticed something beautiful. Cars were pulling over along the road, neighbors and strangers alike stopping to witness the aftermath of Corinne's perfect crime being demolished by perfect justice. Some were taking photos. Others were talking into cell phones. The story of Sheriff Corinne's wedding disaster was already spreading beyond her ability to control. For the first time in months, I smiled. Corinne could arrest me, fine me, or throw me in jail. But she could never again claim that power made her untouchable or that badges made theft legal. My property was mine again, and everyone in 3 counties would know exactly how I had taken it back. The silence after the bulldozer engine died was broken by Corinne's voice cutting through the morning air like a rusty blade. "Thomas Henderson, you are under arrest for destruction of property, disturbing the peace, and interference with a lawful assembly." She advanced on me with handcuffs drawn, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. But before she could reach me, her own deputy stepped between us. It was Jenkins, the same man who had been ready to arrest me just days earlier for obstructing the wedding setup. "Sheriff, maybe we should think about this for a minute," Jenkins said quietly, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers. "All this equipment was placed on his property without his written consent." "I have the signed agreement right here," Corinne snapped, pulling out the forged document that had started this entire nightmare. But now there were witnesses beyond Corinne's control. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, had arrived with her nephew who worked as a paralegal in the county seat. 2 reporters from the Millbrook Gazette had appeared seemingly from nowhere, cameras ready and notebooks out. Most importantly, several wedding guests were holding up cell phones, recording everything that happened next. "Sheriff Hutchins," called out one of the reporters, "can you explain why county equipment was used to transport wedding supplies to private property without the owner's consent?" Corinne spun around, clearly caught off guard by the presence of media. "This is a private family matter." "Using forged documents to steal private property for personal use seems like a public matter," replied the reporter, "especially when it involves elected officials." I watched Corinne's face cycle through emotions like a slot machine spinning toward bankruptcy. She was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that her web of corruption was unraveling in front of witnesses she could not intimidate or silence. The wedding guests themselves were beginning to understand what they had witnessed. Rebecca, Corinne's daughter, stood among the wreckage of her wedding in a $2,000 dress that was now stained with cake frosting and mud. Some guests were quietly slipping away, not wanting to be associated with what was obviously a scandal in the making. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and confused. "You said he had agreed to let us use this place." Corinne's moment of reckoning had arrived, delivered not by courts or investigators, but by her own daughter asking the right question at the wrong time. The facade she had maintained for months was cracking like ice on a warm pond. "Rebecca, honey, this man is clearly unstable," Corinne said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "He agreed to host your wedding and then changed his mind at the last minute." "Then why is he saying you forged his signature?" Rebecca pressed, and I could see the terrible understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. More cars were arriving as word spread through the small town's network of gossip and genuine concern. Some came to gawk at the spectacle, but others came to support me. People who had known me for years, who understood that I was not the kind of man who would destroy a wedding without good reason. "Tom Henderson is one of the most decent men in this county," declared Mrs. Patterson in a voice that carried across the entire property. If he did this, then Sheriff Hutchins must have pushed him beyond all reasonable limits. Corinne looked around at the growing crowd, at the reporters taking notes, at her daughter's wedding dress covered in mud and frosting, at the complete destruction of her perfect plan. For the first time since this ordeal began, I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of arrest or legal consequences, but fear of public exposure and social consequences. The cell phone videos were already being uploaded to social media. The reporters were already composing headlines about corrupt sheriffs and property theft. The wedding guests were already composing their own versions of events to share with friends and family. Corinne's reign of small-town tyranny was ending not with handcuffs and court proceedings, but with public humiliation and social media justice. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is simply making sure everyone can see it clearly. The investigation began within 48 hours of the wedding disaster, launched not by local authorities, but by the state attorney general's office responding to the viral videos and media coverage. The story of Sheriff Corinne's wedding bulldozer had spread far beyond Millbrook County, becoming a symbol of small-town corruption and individual resistance that resonated with people across the state. Detective Lisa Morrison from the State Bureau arrived on Monday morning with a team of investigators and a warrant to examine all documents related to the Henderson property dispute. They spent 3 days going through Corinne's files, interviewing county employees, and analyzing the forged property agreement that had started the entire scandal. The handwriting analysis took less than a week. The signature on the property use agreement was definitely not mine, but it perfectly matched samples of Corinne's own handwriting when she attempted to disguise her style. She had forged my signature herself, probably thinking that no one would ever challenge a sheriff's word against a private citizen's. But the forgery was just the beginning. The investigation uncovered a pattern of abuse dating back years. Corinne had been using her position to pressure local businesses into providing free or discounted services for her family events. She had manipulated county inspections to harass people who had crossed her. She had even used county equipment and personnel for personal moving jobs when her daughter changed apartments. The most damaging evidence came from her own deputies, who finally felt safe to speak out once the state investigation began. Deputy Martinez testified about being ordered to issue frivolous citations. Deputy Jenkins described being pressured to arrest people on trumped-up charges. 3 other deputies came forward with similar stories of being forced to abuse their authority to serve Corinne's personal agenda. Rebecca Hutchins Morrison, Corinne's daughter, provided the most heartbreaking testimony. She revealed that she had never wanted a wedding on my property, but her mother had insisted it was already arranged, and that backing out would embarrass the family. Rebecca had spent months feeling guilty about using someone else's land without meeting them or understanding the circumstances. "I just wanted a simple ceremony at our church," Rebecca told investigators. "But Mom said this was better, more prestigious. I never knew she had forced Mr. Henderson or forged documents. If I had known, I would never have gone along with it." The criminal charges came down like hammers on an anvil: forgery in the first degree, abuse of office, conspiracy to commit fraud, using county resources for personal benefit. The state attorney general announced the charges at a press conference that was broadcast live on 3 local television stations. Corinne's resignation came the same day, delivered through her lawyer without any public statement or apology. She never acknowledged wrongdoing, never expressed regret for the harassment campaign, never apologized to me or her own daughter for the humiliation she had caused. The civil lawsuit settlement took longer to negotiate, but the county insurance company was eager to avoid a public trial that would have exposed even more corruption. They paid for all the legal fees Corinne's harassment had cost me, plus damages for emotional distress and lost property value during the months of citation battles. More importantly, the county commissioners implemented new oversight procedures for the sheriff's department, including mandatory review of all property inspections and citations by an independent oversight board. Future sheriffs would not be able to wage personal vendettas using official county resources. 6 months after the bulldozer wedding, I was sitting on my front porch with Mrs. Patterson, watching the sunset paint the oak grove in gold and amber light. The property had recovered from the wedding disaster, but more importantly, it felt peaceful again. The constant tension of living under harassment had lifted like fog burning off in morning sun. "You did the right thing, Tom," Mrs. Patterson said, rocking gently in Sarah's old chair. "Sometimes bullies only understand one language and you spoke it fluently." I smiled and sipped my coffee, listening to the creek bubble in the distance and the evening birds calling from the trees Sarah and I had planted together. My land was still mine. My dignity was intact. And somewhere in the state capitol, there was now a legal precedent that badges do not grant immunity from consequences when power is abused. The bulldozer sat in the barn, cleaned and maintained, ready for the next time someone needed to clear away something that did not belong on their property. I hoped that time would never come, but if it did, I knew exactly what to do.